Chapter 9 of Kabumpo and Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9 Mixed Magic Makes Mischief. The Book of Records had been perfectly correct in stating that Ruggedo had something on his mind. He had. To understand the mysterious disappearance of Ozma's palace, we must go back to the old ex-king of the gnomes. The whole of the night after he had found Glegg's box of mixed magic, Ruggedo had spent trying to open the box, but pry and poke as he would, it stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. "Better come to bed," advised Wag, twitching his nose nervously. "Mixed magic isn't safe, you know. It might explode." "Idiot," grumbled Ruggedo. "I don't know who Glegg is or was, but I'm going to find out what kind of magic he mixes. I'm going to open this box if it takes me a century." "All right," quavered Wag, retiring backward and holding up his paw. "All right, but remember, I warned you. Don't meddle with magic. That's my motto." "I don't care a harebell what your motto is," sneered the gnome, continuing to hammer on the gold lid. When he reached his room, Wag shut the door and sank dejectedly upon the edge of the bed. "There's no manner of use trying to stop him," sighed the rabbit. "So I've got to get out of here before he gets me into trouble. I'll go tomorrow," resolved Wag, pulling his long ear nervously. With this good resolution, the little rabbit drooped off to sleep. Very cautiously he opened the door of his little rock room next morning. Ruggedo was sound asleep on the floor, his head on the magic box, and Peg Amy, with her wooden arms and legs flung out in every direction, lay sprawled in a corner. "Been shaking you again, the old Scrabble Scratch," whispered the rabbit indignantly, "just 'cause he couldn't open that box. Well, never mind, Peg. I'm leaving today, and as surely as I've ears and whiskers, you shall go too." Picking up the poor wooden doll, Wag tucked her under his arm. Was it imagination, or did the little wooden face break into a sunny smile? It seemed so to Wag, and with a real thrill of pleasure he tiptoed back to his room and began tossing his treasures into one of the bed sheets. He seated Peg in his own small rocking chair, and from time to time he nodded to her reassuringly. "We'll soon be out now, my dear," he chuckled, quite as if Peg had been alive. She often did seem alive to Wag. "Then we'll see what Ozma has to say to this mixed magic," continued the bunny, wiggling his ears indignantly. And so occupied was he collecting his treasures that he did not hear Ruggedo's call, and next minute the angry gnome himself stood in the doorway. "What does this mean?" he cried furiously, pointing to the tied-up sheet. Then he stamped his foot so hard that Peg Amy fell over sideways in the chair, and all the ornaments in the room skipped as if alive. The rabbit whirled round in a hurry. "It means I'm leaving you for good, you wicked little monster!" shrilled Wag, his whiskers trembling with agitation and his ears sticking straight out behind. "Leaving! Do you hear?" Then he snatched Peg Amy in one paw and his treasures in the other and tried to brush past Ruggedo. But the gnome was too quick for him. Springing out of the room, he slammed the door and locked it. Wag could hear him rolling up rocks for further security. "Thought you'd steal a march on old Ruggedo. Thought you'd tell Ozma all his plans and get a nice little reward. Well, think again," shouted the gnome through the keyhole. Wag had plenty of time to think, for Ruggedo never came near the rabbit's room all day. At every sound poor Wag leaped into the air, for he felt sure each blow could only mean the opening of the dreaded magic box. To reassure himself he held long conversations with the wooden doll, and Peg's calm cheerfulness steadied him a lot. I might dig my way out, but it would take so long. My ear tips. How provoking it is!" exclaimed Wag. "But perhaps he'll relent by nightfall." Slowly the day dragged on, but nothing came from the big rock room but thumps, grumbles, and bangs. "It is fortunate that you do not eat, Peg dear," sighed the rabbit late in the afternoon, nibbling disconsolately on a stale biscuit he had found under his bureau. "Shall you care very much if I starve? I probably shall, you know. Of course, no one in Oz can die, but starving forever is not comfortable either." At this the wooden doll seemed to shake her head, as much as to say, "You won't starve, Wag dear. Just be patient a little longer." Not that she really said this, mind you, but Wag knew from her smile that this is what she was thinking. It was hot and stuffy in the little rock chamber, and the faint light that filtered down from the hole in the ceiling was far from cheerful. At last night came, and that was worse. Wag lit his only candle, but it was already partly burned down, and soon with a dismal sputter it went out and left the two sitting in the dark. Peg Amy stared cheerfully ahead, but the rabbit, worn out by his long day of fright and worry, fell into a heavy slumber. Meanwhile, Ruggedo had worked on the magic box, and every minute he became more impatient. All his poundings failed to make even a dent on the gold lid, and even jumping on it brought no result. The little gnome had eaten nothing since morning, and by nightfall he was stamping around the box in a perfect fury. His eyes snapped and twinkled like live coals, and his wispy white hair fairly crackled with rage. Hidden in this box were magic secrets that would doubtless enable him to capture the whole of Oz, but, clumping Kaloogas, how was he to get at 'em? He finally gave the gold box such a vindictive kick that he almost crushed his curly toes. Then, holding on to one foot, he hopped about on the other till he fell over exhausted. For several minutes he lay perfectly still. Then, jumping up, he seized the box and flung it with all his gnome might against the rock wall. "Take that!" screamed Ruggedo furiously. There was a bright flash. Then the box righted itself slowly and sailed straight back into Ruggedo's hands and, more wonderful still, it was open. With his eyes almost popping from his head, the gnome sat down on the floor, the box in his lap. In the first tray were 4 golden flasks, and each one was carefully labeled. The first was marked Flying Fluid. Vanishing Cream was the second. The third flask held Glegg's Instantaneous Expanding Extract, and in the fourth was Spike's Hair Strengthener. Ruggedo rubbed his hands gleefully and lifted out the top tray. In the next compartment was a tiny copper kettle, a lamp, and a package marked Triple Trick Tea. So anxious was Ruggedo to know what was in the last compartment that he scarcely glanced at Glegg's tea set. Quickly he peered into the bottom of the casket. There were 2 boxes. Taking up the first, Ruggedo read, Glegg's Question Box. Shake 3 times after each question. "Great Grampus!" sputtered the gnome. "This is a find!" He was growing more excited every minute, and his hands shook so he could hardly read the label on the last box. Finally he made it out. Reanimating Rays, guaranteed to reawaken any person who has lost the power of life through sorcery, witchcraft, or enchantment, said the label. Well, did anyone ever hear anything more magic than that? Ruggedo glanced from one to the other of the little gold flasks and boxes. There were so many he hardly knew which to use first. Flying Fluid and Vanishing Cream, mused the gnome. Well, they might help after he had captured Oz. but he felt it would take more powerful magic than flying fluid and vanishing cream to capture the fairy kingdom. Next he picked up the bottle labeled Spike's Hair Strengthener. Anything that strengthened would be helpful, so with one eye on the last bottle, Ruggedo absently rubbed some of the hair strengthener on his head. He stopped rubbing in a hurry and put his finger in his mouth with a howl of pain. Then he jumped up in alarm and ran to a small mirror hanging on the wall. Every hair on his head had become an iron spike, and the result was so terrible that it frightened even the old gnome. He flung the bottle angrily on the ground. But stop! He could butt his enemies with the sharp spikes. Comforting himself with this cheerful thought, Ruggedo returned to the magic box. Instantaneous expanding extract, muttered the gnome, turning the bottle over carefully. That ought to make me larger. And if I were larger, He snapped his fingers and began hopping up and down. He was about to empty the bottle over his head when he suddenly reflected that it might be safer to try this powerful extract on someone else. But on whom? Ruggedo glanced quickly around the cave and then remembered the wooden doll. He would try a little on Peg Amy and see how it worked. Turning the key, he stepped softly into Wag's room. Without wakening the rabbit, Ruggedo dragged out the wooden doll. Propping her up against the wall, the gnome uncorked the bottle of expanding fluid and dropped 2 drops on Peg Amy's head. Peg was about 10 inches high, but no sooner had the expanding fluid touched her than she shot up 4 feet, and with such force that she lost her balance and came crashing down on top of Ruggedo, almost crushing him flat. "Get off, you great log of wood!" screamed the gnome, struggling furiously. But this Peg Amy was powerless to do, and it was only after a frightful struggle that Ruggedo managed to drag himself out. He started to shake Peg, but as she was now 4 times his size, he soon gave that up. "Well, anyway, it works," sighed the gnome, rubbing his nose and the middle of his back. "I wonder how it would act on a live person. I'll try a little on that silly rabbit," he concluded, tiptoeing back into Wag's room. Now, Wag's apartment was about 7 feet square, plenty large enough for a regular rabbit. But 2 drops of the expanding fluid and stars! Wag was no longer a regular rabbit, but a 6-foot funny bunny stretching from one end of the room to the other. He expanded without even waking up. Ruggedo had to squeeze past him in order to get out, and chuckling with satisfaction, the gnome hurried back to his box of magic. His mind was now made up. He would take Glegg's mixed magic under his arm, go above ground, and, with the expanding fluid, change himself into a giant. Then conquering Oz would be a simple matter. It was all going to be so easy and amusing that Ruggedo felt he had plenty of time to examine the rest of the bottles and boxes. He rubbed some of the vanishing cream on a sofa cushion, and it instantly disappeared. The box of reanimating rays, guaranteed to reawaken anyone from enchantment, interested the old gnome immensely, but how could he try them when there was no bewitched person about? At least, none that he knew of. Then his eye fell on the question box. Why not try that? So, "How shall I use the reanimating rays?" asked Ruggedo, shaking the box 3 times. Nothing happened at first. Then, by the light from his emerald lamp, the gnome saw a sentence forming on the lid. "Try them on Peg," said the box shortly. Without thinking of consequences or wondering what the question box meant by suggesting Peg, the curious gnome opened the box of rays and held it over the huge wooden doll. For as long as it would take to count 10, Peg lay perfectly still. Then, with a creak and jerk, she sprang to her feet. "How perfectly pomiferous!" cried Peg Amy with an awkward jump. "I'm alive! Why, I'm alive all over!" She moved one arm, then the other, and turned her head stiffly from side to side. "I can walk!" cried Peg. "I can walk! I can skip! I can run!" Here Peg began running around the cave, her joints squeaking merrily at every step. At Peg's first move, Ruggedo had jumped back of a rock, his every spike standing on end. Too late he realized his mistake. This huge wooden creature clattering around the cave was positively dangerous. Why, she might easily pound him to bits. Why on earth had he meddled with the magic rays, and why under the earth should a wooden doll come to life? He waited until Peg had run to the farthest end of the cave. Then he dashed to the magic casket and scrambled the bottles, the trick tea set and the flasks back into place and started for the door that led to the secret passage as fast as his crooked little legs would carry him. But he was not fast enough, for Peg heard and like a flash was after him. "Stop! Go away!" screamed Ruggedo. "Why, it's the old gnome!" cried the wooden doll in surprise. "The wicked old gnome who used to shake me all the time. Why, how small he is! I could pick him up with one hand." She made a snatch at Ruggedo. "Go away!" shrieked Ruggedo, ducking behind a rock. "Go away, there's a dear girl," he added coaxingly. "I didn't shake you much, not too much, you know." Peg Amy put a wooden finger to her forehead and regarded him attentively. "I remember," she murmured thoughtfully. "You found a magic box, and you're going to harm Ozma and try to conquer Oz. I must get that box." Reaching around the rock, she seized Ruggedo by the arm. In a panic he jerked away. "Help! Help!" cried the Gnome King, darting off toward the other end of the cave. "Help! Help!" In his little rock room, Wag stirred uneasily. Then, as Ruggedo's cries grew louder, he bounced erect and almost cracked his skull on the low ceiling. Hardly knowing what he was doing, he rushed at the door, only to knock himself almost senseless against the top, for of course he did not realize he had expanded into a giant rabbit. But as the cries from the other room became louder and louder, he got up and, rubbing his head in a dazed fashion, he somehow crowded himself through the door and hopped into the cave. When he saw Peg Amy chasing Ruggedo, Wag fell back against the wall. "My wocks and hoopsoons!" stuttered the rabbit. "She is alive, and he shrunk." Wag's voice rose triumphantly. "I'm going to pound his curly toes off," he shouted. With this he joined merrily in the chase. "I'll catch him," he called. "I'll catch him, Peg, my dear, and make him pay for all the shakings he has given you. I'll pound his curly toes off." "Oh, Wag, don't do that!" cried the wooden doll, stopping short. "I didn't mind the shakings, and gnomes don't know any better." "Neither do rabbits!" cried Wag stubbornly, bounding after Ruggedo. "I'll pound his curly toes off, I tell you." The old gnome was sputtering like a firecracker. What chance had he now with two after him? Then suddenly he had an idea. Without stopping he fumbled in the box which he still clutched under one arm and pulled out the bottle of expanding fluid. Uncorking the bottle, he poured its contents over his head. Every single drop. This is what happened. First he shot out sideways till Peg and Wag were almost crushed against the wall. With a hoarse scream, Wag dragged Peg Amy back into his room, which was now barely large enough to hold them. They were just in time, for Ruggedo was still spreading. Soon there was not an inch of space left to expand in. Then he shot up and grew and grew and grew and groaned and grew till there wasn't any more room to grow in. So he burst through the top of the cave with a noise like 50 boilers exploding. No wonder Dorothy thought it was a cyclone, for what was on the top of the cave but the royal palace of Oz? The next instant it was impaled fast on the spikes of Ruggedo's giant head and shooting up with him toward the clouds. And that wretched gnome never stopped growing till he was 3/4 of a mile high. If the people in the palace were frightened, Ruggedo was more frightened still. Being a giant was a new experience for him, and having a castle jammed on his head was worse still. The first thing he tried to do when he stopped growing was to lift the castle off, but his spikes were driven fast into the foundations, and it fitted closer than his scalp. In a panic, Ruggedo began to run, and when a giant runs he gets somewhere. Each step carried him a half-mile and shook the country below like an earthquake, and rattled the people in the castle above like pennies in a Christmas bank. Shaking with terror and hardly knowing why, the gnome made for his old kingdom, and in an hour had reached the little country of Oogaboo, which is in the very northwestern corner of Oz, opposite his old dominions. The Deadly Desert is so narrow at this point that with one jump Ruggedo was across, and puffing like a volcano about to erupt, he sank down on the highest mountain in Ev. Fortunately he had not stepped on any cities in his flight, though he had crushed several forests and about 100 fences. "Oh, my head!" groaned Ruggedo, rocking to and fro. He seemed to have forgotten all about conquering Oz. He was full of twinges and growing pains. Ozma's castle was giving him a thundering headache, and there he sat, a fearsome figure in the bright moonlight, moaning and groaning instead of conquering. The Book of Records had been right indeed when it stated that Ruggedo had something on his mind. Ozma's castle itself sat squarely upon that mischievous mind, and every moment it seemed to grow heavier. No wonder there had been confusion in the castle. Every time Ruggedo shook his aching head, Ozma and her guests were tossed about like leaves in a storm. Mixed magic had made mischief indeed. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Kabumpo in Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Peg and Wag to the Rescue. For a long time after the terrific bang following Ruggedo's final expansion, Wag and Peg Amy had been too stunned to even move. Crowded together in the little rock room, they lay perfectly breathless. "Thing's happened," quavered the rabbit at last. "That sounds rather queer, but I think I know what you mean," said Peg, sitting up cautiously. "Something has happened. Ruggedo's been blown up, I guess." "Mixed magic," groaned Wag gloomily. "I knew it would explode. Say, Peg, what makes this room so small?" "I don't know," sighed the doll in a puzzled voice, for neither Peg nor Wag realized how much they had grown. "But let's go above ground and see what has become of Ruggedo." One at a time, and with great difficulty, they got through the door. "Why, there are the stars!" cried Peg Amy, clasping her wooden hands rapturously. "Real stars!" The top of the cave had gone off with the old Gnome King, and the two stood looking up at the lovely skies of Oz. "It doesn't seem so high as it used to," said the rabbit, looking at the walls. "Why, I believe I could jump out if I took a good run and carry you too. Come ashort, Peg." "Aren't you mixed up, Wag dear? Don't you mean come along?" asked Peg, smoothing down her torn dress. "Well, now that you mention it, my head does feel queer," admitted the rabbit, twitching his nose. "Bort of sackwards." "Sort of backwards," corrected Peg gently. "Well, never mind. I know what you mean. But do let's try to find that awful box of magic. You know, Ruggedo brought me to life, Wag, with something in that box." "Only good thing he ever did," said Wag, shaking his head. "But I think you were alive before," he added solemnly. "You always seemed alive to me." "I think so, too," whispered Peg excitedly. "I can't remember just how or where, but oh, Wag, I know I've been alive before. I remember dancing." Peg took a few awkward steps, and Wag looked on dubiously, too polite to criticize her efforts. He didn't even laugh when Peg Amy fell down. Peg laughed herself, however, as merrily as possible. "It's going to be such fun being alive," she said, picking herself up gaily. "Such fun, Wag dear. Why, there's Glegg's box." She pounced upon the little shining gold casket. "Ruggedo didn't take it after all." "Is it shut?" asked Wag, clasping both paws to his ears. "Look out for explosions, say I." "No, but I'll soon close it," said Peg, and shutting Glegg's box, she slipped it into pocket of her dress. It was about half the size of this book you are reading, and as Peg's pockets were big and old-fashioned, it fitted quite nicely. "Come ashort," said Wag again, looking around uneasily, for he was anxious to get out of the gnome's cave. So Peg seated herself carefully on his back and clasped her wooden arms around his neck. Then Wag ran back a few steps, gave a great jump, and sailed up, up, and out of the cave. "10 penny teacups!" shrieked the soldier with the green whiskers, falling over backwards. "What next?" For Wag, with Peg on his back, had leaped straight over his head. Picking himself up, and with every whisker in his beard prickling straight on end, the Grand Army of Oz backed toward the royal stable. When he had backed half the distance, he turned and ran for his life. But he need not have been afraid. "What a funny little man!" chuckled Wag. "Why, he's no bigger than we are. He's no—" Then suddenly Wag clutched his ears. "Oh!" he screamed, beginning to hop up and down. "I forgot all my treasures! My golden goopsoons! My Urple Soolwocks! I've forgotten my Urple Soolwocks!" "Your what?" cried Peg Amy, clutching him by the fur. "Now, Wag dear, you're all mixed up. Perhaps it's 'cause your ears are crossed. There, now do stop wiggling your whiskers and turn out your toes." But Wag continued to wiggle his whiskers and turn in his toes, and roar for his Urple Soolwocks. "Stop!" screamed Peg at last, with both hands over her wooden ears. "I know what you mean. Your purple wool socks." "Yes," sobbed the rabbit, slumping down on a rock and holding his head in both paws. "Well, don't you think—" the wooden doll shook her head jerkily. "Don't you think it's just as well? Ruggedo stole all those things, and you wouldn't want stolen soup spoons, now would you?" Wag took a long breath and regarded Peg uncertainly. Then something in her pleasant wooden face seemed to brace him up. "Ah, no," he sighed solemnly. "I suppose not. I ought to have left Rug long ago." "But then you couldn't have helped me," said Peg brightly. "Let's don't think about it any more. You've been awfully good to me, Wag." "Have I?" said Wag more cheerfully. "Well, you're a good sort, Peg, a regular princess," he finished, puffing out his chest, "and anything you say goes." "Princess!" laughed the wooden doll, pleased nevertheless. "I'm a funny princess in this old dress. Did you ever hear of a wooden princess, Wag? You look like a princess to me, said the rabbit stoutly. Dresses don't matter. This speech so tickled the wooden doll that she gave Wag a good hug and began dancing again. Being alive is such fun, she called gaily over her shoulder, and you are so wonderful. Wag's chest expanded at least 3 inches, and his whiskers trembled with emotion. Hop on my back, Peg, and I'll take you anywhere you want to go, he puffed magnificently. But the wooden doll had suddenly grown sober. Wherever is the castle? She cried anxiously. She remembered exactly where it had stood when she was an unalive doll, and now not a tower or turret of the castle was to be seen. "Oh!" groaned Peg Amy. "Ruggedo has done something dreadful with his mixed magic." Wag rubbed his eyes and looked all around. "Why, it's gone!" he cried, waving his paws. "What shall we do? If only we weren't so small!" "We've got the magic box," said Peg hopefully, "and somehow I don't feel as small as I used to feel, do you?" "Well, I feel pretty queer myself," said the rabbit, twitching his nose. "Maybe it's because I'm hungry. There's a kitchen garden over there near the royal stables, and I think if I had some carrots I'd feel better." "Of course you would!" cried Peg, jumping up. "I forgot you had to eat." So very cautiously they stole into the royal cook's garden. Wag had often helped himself to carrots from this garden before, but now, sitting on his haunches, he stared around in dazed surprise. "Everything's different," wailed the rabbit dismally. "You're the same and I'm the same, but everything else is all mixed up. Look at this carrot. Why, it's no bigger than a blade of grass." Wag held up a carrot in disgust. "Why, it will take 50 of these to give me even a taste. And the lettuce, look at it. Everything's shrunk. Even the houses," cried the big funny bunny, looking around. "My wocks and hoopsoons, everything's hunk." Peg Amy had followed Wag's gaze, and now she jumped up in great excitement. "I see it now!" cried Peg. "It's us, Wag. Everything's the same, but we are different. Some of that mixed magic has made us grow. We're bigger and everything else is the same. I am as tall as the little girl who used to play with me, and you are even bigger, and I'm glad, because now we can help find the castle and Ruggedo and try to make everything right again." Peg clasped her wooden hands. "Aren't you glad too, Wag?" The rabbit shook his head. "It's going to take an awful lot to fill me up," he said doubtfully. "I'll have to eat about 6 times as much as I used to." "Well, you're 6 times as large. Isn't that any comfort?" "My head doesn't feel right," insisted Wag. "As soon as I talk fast the words all come wrong." "Ha ha! Maybe it didn't grow as fast as the rest of you," laughed the wooden doll. "But don't you care, Wag. I know what you mean, and I think you're just splendid. Now hurry and finish your carrots so we can decide what to do." "If mixed magic caused all this trouble," added Peg half to herself, "mixed magic's got to fix it. I'm going to look at that box." Wag, nibbling industriously, had not heard Peg's last speech, or he would doubtless have taken to his heels. Sitting unconcernedly in a cabbage bed, the wooden doll took the gold box from her pocket. Fortunately, she had not snapped the magic snap, and it opened quite easily. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, and the moon was the only light she had to see by. But it did not take Peg Amy long to realize the importance of Glegg's magic. "I wonder if he rubbed this on the castle," she murmured, holding up the bottle of vanishing cream. "And how would one bring it back? Let me see now." One after the other she took out the bottles and boxes and the tiny tea set. The reanimating rays she passed over without realizing they were responsible for bringing her to life, but the question box Peg pounced upon with eager curiosity. "Oh, if it only would answer questions," fluttered Peg. Then, holding the box close to her mouth, she whispered, "Where is Ruggedo?" "Who are you talking to?" asked Wag, looking up in alarm. "Now don't you get mixed up, Peg." "It's a question box," said the wooden doll, "but it's not working very well." She shook it vigorously and held it up so that the light streaming down from the stable window fell directly on it. In silver letters on the lid of the box was one word: Ev. "Ev! Ruggedo's in Ev!" cried Peg Amy, rushing over to the rabbit. "Can you take me to Ev, Wag dear?" "Of course," said Wag, nibbling faster and faster at his carrots. "I'll take you anywhere, Peg." "Then it's going to be all right, I know it," chuckled the wooden doll, and putting all the magic appliances back into the box, she closed the lid with a snap. And this time the magic catch caught. "Is it far to Ev?" asked Peg Amy, looking thoughtfully at the place where the castle had once been. "Quite a long journey," said Wag, "but we'll go a-hopping. Ev is near Ruggedo's old home, and it's across the Deadly Desert, but we'll get there somehow. Trust me. And when I do," spluttered Wag, thumping his hind feet determinedly, "I'll pound his curly toes off, the wicked little monster." "Did you ask the question box where the castle was?" he inquired hastily, for he saw Peg was going to tell him he must not pound Ruggedo. "Why, no. How silly of me." Peg felt in her pocket and brought out the gold box. She tried to open it as she had done before, but it was no use. She pulled and tugged and shook it. Then Wag tried. "There's a secret to it," puffed the rabbit at last. "Took Rug a whole night and day to discover it. Can't you remember how you opened it before, Peg?" The wooden doll shook her head sadly. "Well, never mind," said Wag comfortingly. "Once we find Ruggedo we can make him tell. We'd better start right off, because if any of the people around here saw us they might try to capture us and put us in a circus. We are rather unusual, you know." The rabbit regarded Peg Amy complacently. "One doesn't see 6-foot rabbits and live dolls every day, even in Oz." "No," agreed Peg Amy slowly, "I suppose not." The moon, looking down on the strange pair, ducked behind a cloud to hide her smile, for the giant funny bunny strutting about pompously and old-fashioned wooden Peg in her torn frock were enough to make anyone smile. "You think of everything," sighed Peg, looking affectionately at Wag. "Who wouldn't for a girl like you? You're a princess, Peg, a regular princess." The rabbit said it with conviction, and again Peg happily smoothed her dress. "Hop on," chuckled Wag, "and then I'll hop off." Seating herself on his back and holding tight to one of his long ears, Peg announced herself ready. Then away through the night shot the giant bunny, away toward the western country of the Winkies, and each hop carried him 12 feet forward and sent up great spurts of dust behind. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Kabumpo and Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The King of the Illumination. While Ruggedo was working all this mischief in the Emerald City, Pompadour and the Elegant Elephant had fallen into strange company. After the Prince's disappearance, Kabumpo stared long and anxiously at the white marble stone with its mysterious inscription, "Knock before you fall in." What would happen if he knocked, as the sign directed? Something upsetting, the Elegant Elephant was sure, else why had Pompa called for help? Kabumpo groaned, for he was a luxurious beast and hated discomfort of any sort. As for falling in, the very thought of it made him shudder in every pound. But selfish and luxurious though he was, the Elegant Elephant loved Pompa with all his heart. After all, he had run off with the Prince and was responsible for his safety. If Pompa had fallen in, he must fall in too. With a resigned sigh, Kabumpo felt in his pocket to see that his treasures were safe, straightened his robe and, taking one last long breath, rapped sharply on the marble stone with his trunk. Without a sound, the stone swung inward, and as Kabumpo was standing on it, he shot headlong into a great black opening. There was a terrific rush of air, and the slab swung back, catching as it did so on the fluttering edge of the Elegant Elephant's robe of state. This halted his fall for about a second, and then with a spluttering tear the silk fringe ripped loose, and down plunged the Elegant Elephant, trunk over heels. After the third somersault, Kabumpo, right side up, fortunately, struck a soft inclined slide, down which he shot like a scenic railway train. "Great Grump!" coughed Kabumpo, holding his jeweled headpiece with his trunk. "Great—" Before he reached the second grump, his head struck the top of the passage with a terrific force, and that was the last he remembered about his fall. How long he lay in an unconscious state, the Elegant Elephant never knew. After what seemed several ages, he became aware of a confused murmur. Footsteps seemed to be pattering all around him, but he was still too stunned to be curious. "Nothing will make me get up," thought Kabumpo dully. "I'm going to lie here for ever and ever and ever and—" Just as he reached this drowsy conclusion, something red hot fell down his neck, and a voice louder than all the rest shouted in his ear, "What are you?" "Ouch!" screamed Kabumpo, now thoroughly aroused. He opened one eye and rolled over on his side. A tall, curious creature was bending over him. Its head was on fire, and as Kabumpo blinked angrily, another red-hot shower splattered into his ear. With a trumpet of rage, Kabumpo lunged to his feet. The hot-headed person fell over backwards, and a crowd of similar creatures pattered off into the corner and regarded Kabumpo uneasily. They were as tall as Pompa, but very thin and tube-like in shape, and their heads appeared to be a mass of flickering flames. "Like giant candles," reflected the Elegant Elephant, his curiosity getting the better of his anger. He glanced about hurriedly. He was in a huge white tiled chamber, and the only lights came from the heads of its singular occupants. A little distance away, Prince Pompadore sat rubbing first his knees and then his head. "It's another faller," said one of the giant Candlemen to the other. "Two fallers in one day. This is exciting, and Ouch it calls itself." "I don't care what it calls itself," answered the second Candleman crossly. "I call it mighty rude. How dare you blow out our King?" shouted the hot-headed fellow, shaking his fist at the Elegant Elephant. "Here, some of you light him up." "Blow out your King?" gasped Kabumpo in amazement. Sure enough, he had. There at his feet lay the King of the Candles, stiff and lifeless and with never a head to bless himself with. While the Elegant Elephant stared at the long candlestick figure, a fat little Candleman rushed forward and lit with his own head the small black wick sticking out of the King's collar. Instantly the ruddy flame face of the King appeared, his eyes snapping dangerously. Jumping to his feet, he advanced toward Pompadore. Is this your ouch? Sputtered the king, jerking his thumb at Kabumpo. You must take him away at once. I never was so put out in my life. Me, the hand-dipped king of the whole Illumi nation, to be blown out by a bumpy creature without any headlight. Where's your headlight? He demanded fiercely, leaning over the prince and dropping hot tallow down his neck. Pompa jumped up in a hurry and backed toward Kabumpo. Be careful how you talk to him, roared the elegant elephant, swaying backwards and forward like a big ship. He's a prince, the Prince of Pumperdink. Kabumpo tossed his trunk threateningly. A prince? Sputtered the king, changing his tone instantly. Well, that's different. A prince can fall in on us any time and welcome. But an ouch? Why bring this great clumsy ouch along? He rolled his eyes mournfully at Kabumpo. He's not an ouch, explained Pompa, who was gradually recovering from the shock of his fall. He is Kabumpo, an elegant elephant, and he blew you out by mistake. Didn't you, Kabumpo? Purely an accident, nothing intentional, I assure you, chuckled Kabumpo. He was beginning to enjoy himself. If there's any more trouble, I'll blow 'em all out, he reflected comfortably, for they're nothing but great big candles. Seeing their king in friendly conversation with the strangers, the other candlemen came closer, too close for comfort, in fact. They were always leaning over and dropping hot tallow on a body, and the heat from their flaming heads was simply suffocating. Sing the national air for them, said the Candle King carelessly, and the candlemen, in their queer, crackling voices, sang the following song, swaying rhythmically to the tune. Flicker, flicker, candlemen, cheer our king and cheer again. Neat as wax and always bright, cheers the king of candlelight. Kindle lightly, dwindle slightly, here we burn both day and nightly. Here we have good times to burn, till each one goes out in turn. Thank you, said Pompa, mopping his head with his silk handkerchief. Thank you very much. Kabumpo groaned plaintively, for the great elephant was nearly stifled. How is it you are so tall and thin? Asked Pompa after an awkward pause. How is it you are so short and lumpy and unevenly dipped? Responded King Cheer promptly. If I were in your place, he gave Kabumpo a contemptuous glance, I'd have myself redipped. Where are your wicks? And how can you walk about without being lighted? We're not fireworks, puffed Kabumpo indignantly, and then he gave a shrill scream. 10 candlemen tottered and went out, falling to the ground with a great clatter. Then Pompa leaped several feet in the air, and his scream put out 5 more. Stop! cried King Cheer angrily. Stand where you are! But Kabumpo and Pompa neither stopped nor stood where they were. The elegant elephant rushed over to the prince and threw his heavy robe over his head, and just in time, for Pompa's golden locks were a mass of flames. Then the prince tore off his velvet jacket and clapped it to Kabumpo's tail, which also was blazing merrily. Great Grump! rumbled the elegant elephant furiously, when he had extinguished Pompa, and Pompa had extinguished him. I'll put you all out for this! He raised his trunk and pointed it straight at the candlemen, who cowered in the far corner. I was only trying to light you up, wailed a little fellow, holding out his hands pleadingly. I thought that was your wick. He pointed a trembling finger at Kabumpo's tail and another at Pompa's head. Wick! snorted Kabumpo in a rage, while the prince ran his hands sorrowfully through his once luxuriant pompadour, of which nothing but a short stubble remained. Wick! What would we be doing with wicks? I don't think he meant any harm, put in Pompadour, whose kind heart was touched by the little Candleman's terror, and it wouldn't help us any. Thought it was my wick! shrilled Kabumpo, glaring over his shoulder at his poor scorched tail. He's a wicked little wretch. He's ruined your looks. I know, Pompa sighed dismally. No one will want to marry me now. It's all coming true, Kabumpo, just as Count It Up said. Remember? If a thin prince sets out on a fat elephant to find a proper princess, how many yards of fringe will the elephant lose from his robe, and how bald will the prince be at the end of the journey? And we've scarcely begun. Great haystacks, whistled Kabumpo, his little eyes twinkling. So I have lost every bit of fringe from my robe and my tail and half the back of my robe besides. This is nice, I must say. We only tried to give you a warm welcome, said the King timidly. Warm welcome? Well, I should think you did, sniffed Kabumpo. How do we get out of here? Oh, that's very simple, said the King, cheering up. Tommy, go for the snuffer. Before Kabumpo or Pompa realized what this would mean, a little candleman named Tommy Tallow had returned with a tall black candle person. He stepped to the side wall, quickly jerked a rope, and down over Kabumpo dropped a great brass snuffer, and over the Prince another. That ought to put the cross old things out, Pompa heard the King say, just before his snuffer reached the floor. This is terrible, fumed the poor Prince, thumping on the sides of the huge brass dome. I might as well have stayed at home and disappeared comfortably. Ah, my poor old father and my mother. I wonder where they are now. Sunk in gloomy reflection, Pompadore leaned against the side of the snuffer. And one cannot blame him for feeling dismal. The fall down the deep passage, the shock of losing his hair, and now imprisonment under a stifling brass dome were enough to extinguish the hopes of the stoutest-hearted adventurer. I shall never find a proper princess, wailed Pompa, tying and untying his handkerchief. But just then there was a creak from without, and the great dome lifted as suddenly as it had fallen. So suddenly, in fact, that Pompa fell flat on his back. There stood Kabumpo, winding up the long rope with his trunk and grumbling furiously all the while. Takes more than a snuffer to keep me down, wheezed the Elegant Elephant, hurrying over and jerking the Prince to his feet. 3 humps of my shoulders and off she goes. What makes it so dark? The candlemen have all gone, sighed Pompa, brushing his hand wearily across his forehead. All except that one. In a distant corner sat Tommy Tallow, and the light from his head was the only light in the great chamber. He was reading a book with 10 leaves and looked up in surprise when he saw the Elegant Elephant and Pompadore approaching. Then he started to sputter and ran toward a bell rope at the side of the chamber. "Stop!" shouted Kabumpo, "or I'll blow off your head." At that, the little Candleman trembled so violently that his flame head almost went out. "Now suppose you show us the way out," snapped the Elegant Elephant, stamping one big foot until the floor trembled. "You could burn out," gasped Tommy faintly. "That's what we do." "Don't say out," whispered Pompa anxiously. "We want to go away from here," he explained earnestly. "Back on the top of the ground, you know." "Oh!" whistled Tommy Tallow, his face lighting up. "That's easy. This way, please." He almost ran to a big door at one side of the room and, tugging it open, waved them through. "Goodbye," he called, slamming the door quickly behind them. Kabumpo and the Prince found themselves in a wide, dim hallway. It slanted up gradually, and there were tall candle guards stationed about 100 yards apart all of the way. "Are you going to a birthday party or a wedding?" asked the first guard as they passed him. "Wedding," sniffed Kabumpo. "Why?" "Well, hardly any of the candles go out of here unless they're needed for a birthday or a wedding," explained the guard, shifting his big feet. "You're mighty poorly made, though. What kind of candles do you call yourselves?" "Roman," chuckled Kabumpo with a wink. "We roam around," he added ponderously. Do all the candles used above ground come from here? Asked Pompa curiously. Certainly, replied the guard. All candles come from Illumi, and they don't like to leave either, because as soon as they strike the upper air, they shrink down to ordinary cake and candlestick size. Distressing, isn't it? I suppose it must be, smiled Pompadore. Goodbye. The guard touched his flame hat, and Kabumpo quickened his pace. I want air, rumbled the great elephant, panting along as fast as he could go. I've seen and felt about all I care to see and feel of the Illumi nation. So have I. The Prince of Pumperdink touched his scorched locks and sighed deeply. Oh, I'm afraid Ozma will never marry me now, and Pumperdink will disappear forever. Don't be a gooch, snapped the Elegant Elephant shortly. Our adventures have only begun. They passed the rest of the guards without further conversation, and after about 2 hours came to the end of the long tiled passageway and stepped upon firm ground again. Kabumpo was terribly out of breath, for the whole way had been uphill. For a full minute he stood sniffing the fresh night air. Then, turning around, he looked for the opening through which they had come. Not a sign of the passage anywhere. That's curious, puffed the Elegant Elephant, but never mind, we don't want to go back anyway. I should say not, gasped the Prince wearily. Where are we now, Kabumpo? Still in the Gillikin country, I think, but headed in the right direction. All we have to do is to keep going south, said the Elegant Elephant cheerfully. But we've had nothing to eat since morning, objected Pompadore. That's so, agreed Kabumpo, scratching his head thoughtfully, and not a house in sight. But I smell something cooking, insisted the Prince, sniffing hungrily. So do I, said the Elegant Elephant, lifting his trunk, and it smells like soup. Let's follow our noses, Pompa, my boy. Yours is the longest, laughed the Prince, as Kabumpo swung him upon the elephant's back. So, guided by the fragrant whiffs that came floating toward them, Kabumpo set out through the trees. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Kabumpo and Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Delicious Sea of Soup. Strange that we don't see any houses, puffed Kabumpo, swinging along rapidly. I hear water, answered Pompa, peering out over Kabumpo's head, and there it is. Rippling silver under the rays of the moon, which shone brightly, lay a great inland sea. The trees had thinned out, and a smooth sandy beach stretched down to the shore. A slight mist hung in the air, and all around was the delicious fragrance of vegetable soup. Somebody's making soup, sighed the Prince. But who? And where? Never mind, Pompa, wheezed the Elegant Elephant, walking down to the water's edge. Perhaps you can catch some fish, and while you cook them, I'll go back and eat some leaves. With a jerk of his trunk, Kabumpo pulled a length of the heavy silver thread from his torn robe and handed it up to Pompa. Fastening a jeweled pin to one end, the Prince cast his line far out into the waves. At the first tug, he drew it in. "What is it?" asked the Elegant Elephant, as Pompa pulled the dripping line over his trunk. "Oh, how delicious! How wonderful!" exclaimed the once fastidious Prince of Pumperdink. Kabumpo could hear him munching away with relish. "What is it?" he asked again. "A carrot! A lovely red, delicious, tender carrot!" "Carrot? Who ever heard of a sea carrot?" grunted Kabumpo. "I'm afraid you're not yourself, my boy. Let me see it." Snaps and crunches as Pompa consumed his strange catch were the only answer, and in real alarm the Elegant Elephant moved away from the shore, and in doing so bumped against a white sign stuck in the sand. "Please don't fall in," directed the sign politely. "It spoils the soup." "Soup?" sputtered Kabumpo. Then another sign caught his eye. "Soup C, salted to taste. Help yourself." Come down here directly," cried the Elegant Elephant, snatching the Prince from his back. "Here's the soup, a whole seaful. Now all you need is a bowl." Swallowing convulsively the last bit of carrot, Pompa stood staring out over the tossing, smoking soup sea. Every now and then a bone or a vegetable would bob out of the waves, and the poor hungry Prince of Pumperdink thought he had never seen a more lovely sight in his life. "We'll probably be awarded a china medal for this," chuckled the Elegant Elephant. "Won't old Pumper's eyes stick out when we tell him about it? But now for a bowl." Swinging his trunk gently, Kabumpo walked up the white beach and had not gone more than a dozen steps before he came to a cluster of huge shells. He turned one over curiously. "Why, it's a soup bowl!" whistled the Elegant Elephant. He rushed back with it to Pompadore, who still stood dreamily surveying the soup. "I never thought I'd be so thrilled by a common soup bowl," thought Kabumpo, staring at the Prince in amusement. He stepped out on a rock and dipped up a bowl of the hot liquid. "Here, drink," commanded the Elegant Elephant, handing the bowl to the Prince. "Drink to the Proper Princess and the future Queen of Pumperdink." "Don't go," begged the Prince between gulps. "I shall want two, three, several." Kabumpo laughed good naturedly. "This is the pleasantest thing that has happened to us. Here, have another." Then both Pompa and the Elegant Elephant gasped, for out of the bubbling waves arose the most curious figure that they had ever seen, the most curious and the jolliest. He was made entirely of soup bones, and his head was a monster cabbage, with a soup bowl set jauntily on the side for a cap. For a cabbage head he sang very well, and this was the song to which he kept time by waving a silver ladle. "Ho, I am the King of the Soup Sea, yes, I am the King of the Deep. My crown is a bowl and my scepter a ladle. I fell in the soup when I fell from the cradle, and I find it exceedingly cheap. I stir it up nightly and pepper it rightly, a liquid perfection you'll find. And here is a roll, sirs, so fill up your bowl, sirs, and think of me after you've dined." When he came to dined, the Soup King gave a playful leap and disappeared backward into the waves. Pompa rubbed his eyes and looked at Kabumpo to see whether he had been dreaming. "Oh!" cried Kabumpo, his eyes as round as little saucers. Floating gently toward them were two large, crisp, buttered rolls. "The most charming King I've ever met!" chuckled Kabumpo, scooping up the rolls and handing them to Pompa. Pompa, staring dreamily ahead, first took a drink of soup, then a nibble of roll, too happy for speech. 4 times the Elegant Elephant refilled the bowl. Then, his stomach full for the first time since they had left Pumperdink, the Prince stretched himself out on the sands. "Now," puffed the Elegant Elephant ceremoniously, "if you think you've had quite enough, I'll snatch a few bites myself." Chuckling softly, he made his way back to some young trees and dined luxuriously off their tops. When he returned to the beach, Pompa was fast asleep, and for a few moments Kabumpo was inclined to sleep himself. But then, he reflected, Ozma may require a lot of coaxing before she consents to marry Pompa, and 2 of our precious 7 days are gone. It is plainly my duty to save Pumperdink. Besides, when Pompa is married, he will be King of Oz. Then I, the Elegant Elephant, will be the biggest figure at court. Kabumpo threw up his trunk and trumpeted softly to the stars. Then, giving himself a big shake and a little stretch, he lifted the sleeping Prince to his back and started on again. In about 2 hours he had circled the Soup Sea and, guiding himself by a particularly bright and twinkling star, ran swiftly and steadily toward the south. As the first streaks of dawn appeared in the sky, Kabumpo passed through a quaint little Gillikin village. He snatched a bag of rolls from a doorstep and stuck them into his pocket, but he did not stop. And so fast asleep was the little village that except for a few wide-awake roosters, no one knew how important a person had passed through. The sky grew pinker and pinker. You have no idea how pink the morning skies in Oz can be. Just as the sun got out of bed, the Elegant Elephant came to the wonderful Emerald City itself, shining and fairy-like as a dream under the lovely colors of sunrise. Kabumpo paused and took a deep breath. Even he was impressed, and it took a good bit to impress him. He reached back and touched Pompa with his trunk. "Wake up, my boy," whispered Kabumpo in a trembling voice. "Wake up and put on your crown, for we have come to the city of your proper Princess." Pompa sat up and rubbed his eyes in amazement. Without a word, he took the crown Kabumpo handed up to him and set it on his scorched golden head. Accustomed as Pompa was to grandeur, for Pumperdink is very magnificent in its funny old-fashioned way, he could not help but gasp at Ozma's fair city. The lovely green parks, the houses studded with countless emeralds, the shining marble streets filled the Prince with wonder. "I don't believe she'll ever marry me," he stuttered, beginning to feel quite frightened at his boldness. "Nonsense!" wheezed Kabumpo faintly. He was beginning to have misgivings himself. "Sit up now, look your best, and I'll carry you straight into the palace gardens." No one was awake. Even the soldier with the green whiskers lay snoring against a tree, so that Kabumpo stole unobserved into the royal gardens. "I don't see the palace," whispered Pompa anxiously. "Wouldn't it show above the trees?" "It ought to," said Kabumpo, wrinkling up his forehead. "But look, who is that?" Pompa's heart almost stopped, and even Kabumpo's gave a queer jump. On a golden bench just ahead sat the loveliest person either had seen in all of their 18 birthdays. "Ozma!" gasped the Elegant Elephant, as soon as he had breath enough to whisper. "What luck! You must ask her at once." "Not now," begged the Prince of Pumperdink, as Kabumpo unceremoniously helped him to the ground. His knees shook, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He had never proposed to a fairy princess before in his whole life. Then, all at once, he had an idea. Slipping his hand into the Elegant Elephant's pocket, he drew out the magic mirror. "I'll see if she's a princess," stuttered Pompa. The elephant shook his head angrily, but was afraid to speak again lest he disturb the quiet figure on the bench. "And I'll not propose unless she is one," said Pompa, tiptoeing toward the bench. Without making a sound, he suddenly held the mirror before the startled and lovely lady. "Glinda, good sorceress of Oz," flashed the mirror promptly. "Great gooseberries!" cried Glinda, springing to her feet in alarm and swinging around on Pompa. "Where did you come from?" After studying a whole day and night in her magic books, Glinda had returned to the Emerald City to try to perfect her plan for rescuing Ozma. "From Pumperdink, your Highness," puffed Kabumpo, lunging forward anxiously. He too had seen the words in the mirror, and the fear of offending a sorceress made him quake in his skin, which was loose enough to quake in, dear knows. "A thousand pardons!" cried the Prince, dropping on one knee and taking off his crown. "We are seeking Princess Ozma, the fairy ruler of Oz." Glinda looked from Kabumpo to the Prince and controlled a desire to laugh. The Elegant Elephant's torn and scorched robe hung in rags from his shoulders, and his jeweled headpiece was dangling over one ear. Pompa's clothes were equally shabby, and his almost bald head, with a lock sticking up here and there, gave him a singular and comical appearance. "Pumperdink?" mused Glinda, tapping her foot thoughtfully. Then, like a flash, she remembered the entry in the Book of Records. The Prince of Pumperdink is journeying toward the Emerald City. "Why did you want to see Ozma?" asked Glinda anxiously. Perhaps these two strangers could throw some light on the mysterious disappearance of the royal palace. "Our country was threatened with disappearance, and I thought—" "He thought Ozma might help us," finished the Elegant Elephant breathlessly. He did not believe in telling strange sorceresses about everything. Now, if Glinda had not been so occupied with the disappearance of the palace and all the dearest people in Oz, she might have been more curious about the disappearance of Pumperdink. As it was, she just shook her head sadly. "I'm afraid Ozma cannot help you," she said, "for Ozma herself has disappeared. Ozma and everyone in the palace." "Disappeared?" trumpeted the Elegant Elephant, sitting down with a thud. "Great Grump! The thing's getting to be a habit." What was to become of Pompa now? Would he never be king? Nor he, Kabumpo, ever be known as the most elegant elephant in Oz? Had they made the long journey in vain? "Where? When?" gasped Prince Pompadore. "Night before last," explained Glinda. "I've been consulting my magic books ever since, but have only been able to discover one fact." "What is that?" asked Kabumpo faintly. "They are in Ev," said Glinda, "and that a giant carried them off. I came here early this morning to see whether I could discover anything new. Would you care to see where the castle stood?" "Did he carry the castle off too?" shuddered Pompa. Glinda nodded gloomily and led them over to the great hole in the center of the gardens. For a minute she stood watching them. Then, glancing at a golden sundial in the center of a lovely flower bed, she murmured, half to herself, "I must be off." Next instant she clapped her hands and down swept a shining chariot drawn by white swans. "Goodbye!" called Glinda, springing in lightly. "I'm off to Ev to try my magic against the giants. Wait here, and when I've helped Ozma, perhaps I can help you." "Can't we help you? Can't we go?" cried Pompa, running a few steps after the chariot. But Glinda, already high in the air, did not hear him, and in the wink of an eye the chariot and its lovely occupant had melted into the pink morning clouds. "Oh, now what do we do?" groaned the Prince, letting his arms drop heavily at his sides. "Do?" snorted Kabumpo. "The thing for you to do is to act like a prince instead of a gooch. There are other ways of getting to Ev than by chariot." The thought of Kabumpo in Glinda's chariot made Pompa smile in spite of himself. "There, that's better," said the Elegant Elephant more pleasantly. "Now, what's to hinder us from going to Ev and rescuing Princess Ozma? She couldn't help marrying you if you saved her from a giant, could she?" "But could I save her? That's the question," muttered the Prince, looking uneasily at the yawning cavity where the castle had stood. "This giant must be a terrible fellow." "Pooh!" said Kabumpo airily. "Who's afraid of giants? I'll wind my trunk around his leg and pull him to earth. Then you can dispatch the villain. We must get you a sword, though," he added softly. "All right, I'll do it!" cried the Prince, throwing out his chest. The very thought of killing a giant made him feel about 10 feet high. "Do you know the way to Ev, Kabumpo? We'll have to hurry, because unless I marry Ozma before the 7 days are up, my poor old father and mother and all of Pumperdink will disappear forever." You see, even Pompa had now got it into his head that Ozma was the proper princess mentioned in the scroll. "We'll start at once," sighed the Elegant Elephant a bit ruefully. "I've had no sleep and precious little to eat, but when you are King of Oz, You can reward old Kabumpo as he deserves." "Everything I have will be yours!" cried the Prince, giving the elephant, or as much of him as he could grasp, a sudden hug. Then each took a long drink from one of the bubbling fountains, and, munching the rolls Kabumpo had picked up in the Gillikin village, the two adventurers stole out of the gardens. As they reached the gates, Kabumpo paused, and his little eyes twinkled with delight. There lay the soldier with the green whiskers, snoring tremendously, and beside him was a long, sharp sword with an emerald handle. "Just what we need," chuckled Kabumpo, snatching it up with his trunk. Then out through the gates and swiftly through the still sleeping city swept the Elegant Elephant and the Prince of Pumperdink, off to rescue Princess Ozma, a prisoner in Ev. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Kabumpo and Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. On the Road to Ev. In their journey to Ev, Peg and Wag had a night's start of Kabumpo and Prince Pompadore, but towards morning Wag's ears began to droop with sleep. "Got a natch of sap, Peg," Wag muttered thickly as they halted on a little hill. "Natch of sap? What's that?" asked the wooden doll anxiously. Wag made no answer, just flopped on his side and in a minute was asleep and snoring tremendously. "Oh," whispered Peg, pulling herself gently from beneath the sleeping rabbit. "He meant snatch a nap." She laughed softly and seated herself under a small tree. The birds were beginning to waken, and their singing filled Peg Amy with delight. "How wonderful it all is!" she murmured, gazing up at the little ruffly pink clouds. "How wonderful it is to be alive! Hello, Mr. Robin!" she called gaily as a bird flew to a low bush beside her. "Are your children quite well?" The robin swung backward and forward on his swaying branch, then burst into his best morning song. "Oh!" cried Peg Amy, clasping her wooden hands. "I've heard that before. But how could I?" she reasoned. "I'm only a wooden doll, and this is the first morning I have been alive. But then, how did I know it was a robin?" Peg rubbed her wooden forehead in perplexity, for it was all very puzzling indeed. Below their little hill stretched the lovely land of the Winkies, with its gray-green forests and little yellow villages. The wind sent the leaves dancing above Peg's head, and the early sunbeams made lovely patterns on the grass. "I've seen it before!" gasped the wooden doll breathlessly. "The trees, the birds, the houses, and everything." Springing to her feet, she ran awkwardly from bush to tree, touching the leaves and bending over the flowers as if they were old friends. Had it not been for the squeaking of her wooden joints, Peg would almost have forgotten she was a wooden doll, for at the sight of the lovely green growing things something warm and sunny seemed to waken in her stiff wooden breast. "I've been alive before," said Peg Amy over and over. Suddenly, through the still morning air, came a loud, shrill laugh. Peg, who had been standing with her cheek pressed closely against a small tree, swung around quickly, so quickly in fact that she fell over and lay in a ridiculously bent double position before the newcomers. It was Kabumpo and the Prince of Pumperdink. Traveling by the same road Wag had chosen, but much more rapidly, the Elegant Elephant had come at sunrise to the little hill. He had been watching Peg for some time, and when he saw her dance awkwardly over to the tree, he could no longer restrain himself. "Ho, ho, ho! Get out your mirror!" roared Kabumpo, shaking all over with mirth. "Here is your proper Princess, Pompa, my boy, as royal a maiden as the country boasts. Ho, ho, kerump!" Don't be ridiculous, snapped Pompa, looking down curiously at the comical figure of Peg Amy. But she's so funny, gasped Kabumpo, the tears rolling down his big cheeks. Who's funny? Demanded an angry voice, and Wag, who had been awakened by Kabumpo's loud roars, hopped up, his ears quivering with rage. I'll pull your long nose for you, cried Wag, advancing threateningly. Don't you dare make fun of Peg. What are you, anyway? Great Grump, choked Kabumpo, without answering Wag's inquiry. What kind of rabbit is this? A clawing, chawing, scratching kind, as you'll soon find out. Wag drew himself up into a ball and prepared to launch himself at Kabumpo's head when Peg straightened up and caught him by the ear. Don't, Wag, please, she begged. He couldn't help laughing. I am funny. You know I am. She sighed a bit ruefully. You're not funny to me, blustered Wag, still glaring at Kabumpo. Who does he think he is? I? Sniffed Kabumpo, spreading out his ears complacently. I am the elegant elephant of Pumperdink. Notice my pearls, gaze upon my robe. You don't look very elegant to me, snorted Wag. You look more like a tramp. Says he's a l'elegant elephant from Dumperdink, he whispered scornfully to Peg. And what's that you've got on your back? He called with a wave of his paw at Pompa. A dunce? Dunce! Screamed Kabumpo furiously. This is the Prince of Pumperdink, you good-for-nothing lettuce-eater. What do you mean by laughing at royalty? Royalty? Ho, ho, ha, ha! Roared Wag, rolling over and over in the grass. Ha! But he's so funny! He paused to take another look at the Prince. At this, Kabumpo lunged forward, his eyes snapping angrily. Stop! Begged the Prince, tugging Kabumpo by the ear. You were rude to his friend, that, doll, so you must expect him to be rude to me. It's all your fault, he added reproachfully. Are you a prince? Asked Peg Amy, staring up at Pompa with her round, painted eyes. Of course he's a prince, didn't I say so before? Who is that hoppy creature? That's Wag, such a dear fellow. Peg smiled confidently at Kabumpo, and he was suddenly ashamed of himself for laughing at her. Well, he needn't get waggish with me, grumbled the Elegant Elephant in a lower voice. Oh, don't quarrel, begged Peg. It's such a lovely morning, and you both look so interesting. Kabumpo eyed the big wooden doll attentively. It was smart of her to think him interesting. He cleared his throat gruffly. You're not as funny as you look, he admitted grandly, which was the nearest to an apology he had ever come. But what are you doing here, and why are you alive? I don't know, explained Peg apologetically. It just happened last night. It did? Well, where are you going? Wag still looked cross, and his nose was twitching violently, but Peg politely answered Kabumpo's question. We're on our way to Ev to try to help Ozma, said the wooden doll, folding her hands quaintly. Why, so are we, cried Pompa, sliding down Kabumpo's trunk in a hurry. How do you expect to help her? Grunted Kabumpo, looking at Wag and Peg contemptuously. Don't mind him, begged Pompa, running up to Peg Amy. Tell me everything you know about Ozma. Is she pretty? Beautiful, breathed Peg, looking up at the sky. Beautiful and lovely and good. That's why I want to help her. Then I shan't mind marrying her at all, said Pompa with a great sigh of relief. Gooch! Roared Kabumpo angrily, telling everything you know. Do you mean to say you think Ozma would marry you? Gasped Wag, sitting up with a jerk. Oh, my wocks and hoopsoons! His ears crossed and uncrossed, and with a final gurgle of disbelief, Wag fell back on the grass. Is there anything so strange in that? Asked Pompa in a hurt voice. I've got to marry her, he added desperately, appealing to Peg Amy. And while Kabumpo stood sulkily swinging his trunk, the Prince told Peg the whole story of the magic scroll. "I said you looked interesting," breathed Peg as Pompa paused for breath. "Did you hear that, Wag? Unless he marries a proper princess in a proper time, his whole kingdom will disappear. His kingdom and everyone in it." "But how do you know Ozma is the proper princess?" asked Wag, chewing a blade of grass. "The scroll didn't say Ozma, did it?" "Kabumpo thinks Ozma is the proper princess," explained Pompadore, nodding toward the Elegant Elephant, "and he's usually right." "Humph!" sniffed Wag. "Well, maybe you are a prince. You're not really bad looking if you had some fur on your head," he remarked more amiably. "What happened? Somebody pulled it out?" "Oh, Wag!" murmured Peg Amy in a shocked voice. "Burned off," sighed Pompa, and proceeded to tell of their fall into the illumination. He even told them about the Soup Sea and their meeting with Glinda the Good. "Don't you care," said the big wooden doll as Pompa mournfully rubbed his scorched head. "It will soon grow again, and I don't see how Ozma could help loving you. You're so tall and so polite." This kind little speech affected Pompa so deeply that he dropped on one knee and raised Peg's wooden hand to his lips. "The creature has a lot of sense," mumbled Kabumpo with his mouth full of leaves. "Creature!" exclaimed Wag, sitting up straight and opening his eyes wide. "Her name is Peg Amy, Mr. Nelegant Lelephant." "Oh, all right," sniffed Kabumpo hastily. "But you'll have to admit she's curious." "Of course she is," said Wag complacently. "That's why I like her. She wasn't cut out to be a beauty, but to be companionable, and she is. When you've known Peg as long as I have—" Wag paused impressively. "You'll be proud to carry her on your back, Mr. Longnose." "I've only known her a few minutes and I adore her," said Pompa heartily. "Mistress Peg and I are good friends already." Peg curtsied awkwardly. "I've done this before," she reflected curiously to herself. "Shall we tell them about Ruggedo?" Peg asked aloud, turning to Wag. "Yes, do," begged Pompa. "Tell us something about yourselves. I never saw so large a rabbit in my life as Wag, and as for you—" Pompa paused, for Wag was eyeing him resentfully. "You are the largest, most delightful doll I have ever met. The only alive one, I might say. How did you know about Ozma's disappearance? And how were you going to help her?" "Mixed magic," whispered Wag, crossing his ears and his eyes as well. "Mixed magic." "Magic?" gulped Kabumpo, swallowing a branch of sticky leaves whole. "Have you any magic?" "A whole box full," sighed Peg Amy, patting her pocket softly. "In that box is the magic that brought Peg to life," shrilled Wag, pointing a trembling paw. "In that box is the magic that made us grow. In that box is the magic that caused Ozma's castle to disappear." "Great Grump!" whistled Kabumpo. "How fortunate we fell in with them, Pompa." He held out his trunk. "Give me the box, my good girl, and you shall be fittingly rewarded when Pompa is King of Oz." "That's a long time to wait," chuckled Wag, tickled by Kabumpo's outrageous impudence. "No, Peg and I will just keep the box, thank you." "Of course you will," said Prince Pompadore, frowning at Kabumpo. "But as we are both bound on the same errand, let us travel together. Kabumpo and I are going to kill the giant who ran off with the castle." The Prince held up his long sword. "And if you can help us, I shall thank you from the bottom of my heart." Pompa stretched out his hand impulsively. "Well, that's more like it," said Wag, pulling his ear thoughtfully. "And 4 heads are better than 2. "Of course we'll help you!" cried Peg Amy. "The trouble is we don't know ourselves how to open the magic box, but we do know that Ruggedo is in Ev, and when we get there we will make him open the box and undo all this mischief." You mentioned him before, said Kabumpo, holding up his trunk. Who is Ruggedo, and what has he to do with Ozma? Ruggedo is a wicked little gnome, explained Peg Amy gravely. He used to be king of the gnomes, but he was banished from his kingdom and Ozma gave him a little cottage in the Emerald City. He pretended to live there, but instead he tunneled a cave right underneath the palace. Wag helped him dig. Peg waved her hand at the rabbit. And he was the only one who would stay with him. Then Ruggedo stole me. I was only a small, unalive doll belonging to Trot, a little girl who lives with Ozma. Ruggedo stole me just to shake, continued Peg, shuddering. That's why I'm going to pound his curly toes off, screamed Wag, beginning to hop about at the very thought of Ruggedo. But how did you come to be so large and alive? Asked Kabumpo, who was growing more interested. Well, one night, Peg dropped her voice to a whisper, one night Ruggedo found this box of mixed magic hidden in the cave, and then, screamed Wag hoarsely, in some way we don't understand, Peg and I grew big. Peg came alive, the top blew off the cave, and depend upon it, whatever has happened to Ozma and her palace happened from something in that box. It's all Ruggedo's fault. When I catch him— Wag began to wiggle his nose and paw his whiskers. My wocks and hoopsoons! I'll pound his curly toes off. And I'll help you, cried Kabumpo heartily. He could not help but admire such spirit. Come on, let's start. You may ride on my back with Pompa if you care to, finished the Elegant Elephant with a sidelong glance at Peg. Oh, thank you, smiled the Wooden Doll, but Wag will carry me. I always carry Peg, said Wag jealously. I've known her the longest. Oh, all right, sniffed Kabumpo, lifting Pompa up. But if she ever wants to ride on my back, she may. Grunted Wag as the Wooden Doll settled herself on his shoulders. Isn't he generous? Peg pulled down one of Wag's long ears. It was kindly meant, whispered the Wooden Doll merrily. Ready? Puffed Kabumpo, backing out into the road. We've no time to lose, for if we lose time, we lose our kingdom too. Forward for Pumperdink! All right, cried Wag, giving a great leap. Follow me! And off hopped the giant bunny so fast that Kabumpo had to stretch his legs even to keep him in sight. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Kabumpo and Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Terror in Ozma's Palace. Meanwhile, strange things had been happening in Ozma's palace. For the people inside, it had been a very mean time indeed. During Ruggedo's run to the mountains of Ev, they had almost been shaken out of their wits, and when he sat down upon the mountain top, there was not a person nor piece of furniture standing in the whole palace. Courtiers and servants who were not knocked senseless lay shaking in their beds, or huddled in corners and under sofas and chairs, just as they had fallen when the first terrible crash lifted the palace into the air. Ozma's four-poster bed had collapsed, pinning the little fairy princess under a mass of silk hangings and curtain poles. Being a fairy, Ozma was unhurt, but not being able to move, nor to reach her magic belt, or even make herself heard, she was forced to lie perfectly still and wait for help. In Dorothy's sitting room, there was not a sound but the ticking of the Copper Man's machinery. Trot and Betsy Bobbin had knocked their heads together so smartly that they were unconscious. Sir Hokus had been hurled violently against Tik-Tok, and the poor knight had known nothing since. Dorothy lay quietly beside him, an ugly bruise on her forehead, where the emerald clock had landed. "Scraps!" called the Scarecrow some time after the rumble and tumble had ceased. "Are you there?" No, here!" gasped the Patchwork Girl, sitting up cautiously. She had bounced all around the room and finally rolled into a corner quite close to the Scarecrow himself. She put out her cotton hand as she spoke and touched him. "How fortunate we are unbreakable," said the Scarecrow, pressing her cotton fingers convulsively and trying to peer out through the intense blackness of the room. "What happened?" "Earthquake!" shivered Scraps. "And maybe it's not over." "Must have knocked everybody silly," said the Scarecrow huskily. "Except us," giggled the Patchwork Girl. "We couldn't be knocked silly 'cause we were silly in the first place." "Now don't make jokes, please," begged the Scarecrow. "This is serious. Besides, I want to think." "All right," said Scraps cheerfully. "I don't, but I'm going to feel around and see if I can find the matches. There used to be some candles on the mantel and—" As she spoke, Scraps fell headlong over Sir Hokus of Pokes, and as luck would have it, her cotton fingers closed over a small gold matchbox. Picking herself up carefully, Scraps struck a match on Sir Hokus's armor and looked anxiously around the room. "They need water," said the Patchwork Girl, wrinkling up her patchwork forehead. "So will you if you don't blow out that match!" cried the Scarecrow in alarm, for Scraps continued to hold the match till it burned to the very end. He jumped up clumsily and puffed out the light just in time. Scraps promptly lit another, and as she did so, the Scarecrow saw a tall blue candle sticking out of the wastebasket. "Here," said the Straw Man nervously, "light this and stand it on the mantel there." By the flickering candlelight, the Scarecrow and Scraps tried to set Dorothy's room to rights. They dragged the mattress from the bedroom and placed the little girls on it side by side. Sir Hokus was too heavy to move, so they merely loosened his armor and put a sofa cushion under his head. Then, just as Scraps was going for some water, the room began to tremble again. "I told you it wasn't over!" cried Scraps, flinging both arms about the Scarecrow's neck. And as they rocked to and fro, she shouted merrily: "Shaker, shaker, who art thee, to shake a castle like a tree? Shaker, shaker, go away, and come again some other day." "Now, Scraps," begged the Scarecrow, steadying the Patchwork Girl with one hand and catching hold of a table with the other, "everything depends on us. Do try to keep your head." "Keep my head!" shrilled Scraps, as the room tilted over and slid all the furniture sideways. "I'll be lucky if I keep my feet. Whoopee! Here we go!" And go they did, with a rush into the farthest corner. Slowly the room righted itself and everything grew quiet again. "I know what I'm going to do," said the Scarecrow determinedly. "Before anything else happens, I'm going to see what has happened already." "How?" asked Scraps, bouncing to her feet. "The magic picture!" gasped the Scarecrow. "You bring the candle, Scraps, like a good girl. You're less liable to take fire than I am. Then we'll come back and help Dorothy and the others." "Good idea," said Scraps, taking the candle from the mantel. Breathlessly the two tiptoed along the hall to Ozma's apartment. On the wall in one of Ozma's rooms hangs the most magic possession in Oz. It is a picture representing a country scene, but when you ask it where a certain person is, immediately he is shown in the picture and also what he is doing at the time. "So," murmured the Scarecrow, as they gained the room in safety, "if it tells where other people are, it ought to tell us where we are ourselves." Drawing aside the curtain that covered the picture, the Scarecrow demanded loudly, "Where are we?" Scraps held the candle so that its flickering rays fell directly on the picture. Then both jumped in earnest, for in a flash the face of Ruggedo, the wicked old Gnome King, appeared, on his head a great green towering sort of hat. The Scarecrow seized the candle from Scraps and held it closer to the picture. He squinted up one eye and almost rubbed his painted nose off. "Great Kinkajuice!" sputtered the straw man distractedly. "That's a palace on his head. An emerald palace! Ozma's palace!" "But how?" asked Scraps, her suspender button eyes almost dropping out. "He's nothing but a gnome. He's—" Before Scraps could finish her sentence the palace began to tilt forward and they both fell upon their faces. Then the picture jerked loose and fell with a clattering slam on their heads, followed by such ornaments as had not already tumbled down before. Through it all Scraps held the candle high in air and fortunately it did not go out, despite the turmoil. In a few minutes the palace stopped rocking and a muffled call from Ozma sent the Scarecrow and Scraps hurrying to her bedside. After some trouble, for they were both flimsily made, they managed to free the little Princess of Oz from the poles and bed curtains. "Oh, goodness!" sighed Ozma, looking around at the terrible confusion. "Not goodness, but badness," said the Scarecrow, settling his hat firmly. "And Ruggedo is at the bottom of it and of us." He quickly explained to Ozma what he had seen in the magic picture. Slipping on a silk robe, Ozma followed them into the next room. When the picture had been rehung, they all looked again. This time Ozma asked where the palace was. Immediately the old Gnome King appeared and there could be no mistake. The palace was set squarely on his head. The picture did not show the real size of Ruggedo, nor of the palace, but it was enough. "He must have sprung into a giant!" gasped Ozma, scarcely believing her eyes. "Oh, what shall we do?" "The first thing to do is to keep him quiet. Every time he shakes his head it tumbles us about so," complained the Scarecrow, plumping up the straw in his chest. "And we must look after Dorothy and Betsy and Trot." "And Sir Hokus," added the Patchwork Girl, flinging out one hand. "He's yearning to slay a giant. Way for the giant killer!" Without waiting for the others, Scraps ran back to Dorothy's sitting room. Lighting another candle, for all the lights in the palace were out, Ozma and the Scarecrow followed. "Odds goblins!" gasped the Knight as they entered. He was sitting up with one hand to his head. "Not goblins, giants!" cried the Patchwork Girl with a bounce, while Ozma ran for some water to restore her three little friends. "Where?" puffed the Knight, lurching to his feet. "Beneath you," said the Scarecrow, clutching at a wisp of straw that stuck out of his head. "Say, someone wind up Tik-Tok. There's a lot of thinking to be done here and his head works very well, even if it has wheels inside." Sir Hokus, though still a bit dizzy, hastened to wind up all the Copper Man's keys. "Thanks," said Tik-Tok immediately. "Give me a lift up, Hokus." The Knight obligingly helped the Copper Man to his feet. Then both stared in amazement at the topsy-turvy room. Even in the dim candlelight they could see that something very serious had occurred. Jack Pumpkinhead picked himself up out of a corner, looking very much dazed. Just then Dorothy opened her eyes, and Betsy and Trot, sputtering from the water the Patchwork Girl was pouring on their heads, sat up and wanted to know what had happened. In a few words Ozma told them what the magic picture had revealed. "Ruggedo to a giant's grown and set us on his head. We've made some headway, you'll admit, since we have gone to bed," shouted Scraps, who was growing more and more excited. "Ruggedo will never reform," ticked the Copper Man sadly. "But what are we going to do?" wailed Dorothy. "Suppose he leans over and spills us all out." "I shall take my sword," said Sir Hokus, speaking very determinedly and backing toward the window as he spoke, "climb down and slay the villain." He threw one leg over the sill. "Come back!" cried Ozma. "Dear Sir Hokus, don't you realize that if you kill Ruggedo he will fall down and break us to pieces? Besides, wicked as he is, I could not have him killed." "Yes, we should be all broken up if you did that," sighed the Scarecrow. "We must try something else." Reluctantly, the Knight dropped back into the room. "Close the windows," ordered Ozma with a little shudder. "I've thought of a plan," said Tik-Tok in his slow, painstaking way. "A very good plan." "Tell us what it is," begged Dorothy. "And oh, Tik-Tok, hurry!" "Eggs," said the Copper Man solemnly. "Oh!" gasped Dorothy. "I remember. Eggs are the only thing in Oz that Ruggedo is afraid of, for if an egg touches a gnome he shrivels up and disappears." "Then where are the eggs?" demanded Sir Hokus gloomily. "In faith, this sounds more like an omelet than a battle, but if we're to fight with eggs instead of swords, let us draw them at once." "You mean throw them," corrected Dorothy, but Tik-Tok shook his head violently. "Not throw them," said the Copper Man slowly. "Threaten to throw them." "But how can we threaten a giant so far below us?" asked Ozma. "Print a sign," directed Tik-Tok calmly, "and lower it down to him." "Tik-Tok!" cried the Scarecrow, rushing forward and embracing him impulsively. "Your patent action double guaranteed brains are marvels. I couldn't have thought up a better plan myself." Now off ran Scraps to fetch a huge piece of cardboard, and the Scarecrow for a paintbrush, and Sir Hokus for a piece of rope. "It's growing lighter," quavered Trot, looking toward the windows. The sky was turning gray with little streaks of pink, and the three girls huddled together on the mattress gave a sigh of relief, for nothing, not even a giant, seemed so bad by daylight. "Perhaps someone has already started to help us," said Ozma hopefully. "But here's the signboard. What shall we write?" "How shall I begin?" asked the Scarecrow, dipping the brush into a can of green paint. "Dear Ruggedo?" "I should say not!" said Dorothy indignantly. "Then I shall simply say, 'Sir,'" said the Scarecrow. "If you move or turn or shake your head again, 10,000 eggs will be hurled from the palace windows," suggested Tik-Tok. As this message met with general approval, the Scarecrow set it down with many flourishes and blotches of paint spilled between them. Then Ozma painted her name and the royal seal of Oz at the end. Meanwhile, with the help of a pair of field glasses, Sir Hokus had located Ruggedo's nose, sticking out like a huge cliff below the middle window of Dorothy's room. So, tying a long rope to each corner of the sign and rolling it up so it would go through the window, the Knight let it down till it dangled directly in front of Ruggedo's nose. At first Ruggedo did not even see the sign, which was about as large as the tiniest visiting card compared to him. But it blew against his face and tickled his cheek. He tried to brush it away. Then, suddenly, noticing it was dangling from above, he seized it with one hand and held it close to his left eye. The words were so small for a giant that Ruggedo had to squint fearfully before he could make them out at all. But when he did, he gave a blood-curdling scream and began to tremble violently. Up in the palace the entire company fell over and 20 windows were shaken to bits. Then everything grew quiet and there was perfect silence, for Ruggedo, realizing his danger, grew rigid with fright. Giant drops of perspiration trickled down his forehead. How long could he keep from moving? "Well," said Dorothy after a few minutes had passed, "I guess that will keep him quiet, but what next? Shall we let ourselves down with ropes?" "We have none long enough," said Sir Hokus. "Then I'll fall out and go for help," said the Scarecrow brightly, and started toward the window. When he reached it, he paused in astonishment. "Look!" he cried, waving excitedly to the others. "Here comes someone walking right over the clouds." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Kabumpo and Oz by Ruth Plumly Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Sandman Takes a Hand. Someone was coming toward the palace. A little gray-cloaked old gentleman, a surprisingly quick and nimble old gentleman, springing from cloud to cloud and pausing now and then to straighten a huge sack he carried over his left shoulder. He was so busy admiring the lovely sky colors behind him and waving merrily at the fluffy cloud figures above his head that he did not see Ozma's shining palace until he was almost upon it. "Stars!" murmured the little old gentleman, balancing perilously on the very edge of a silver cloud. "Another air castle! How delightful! I shall jump right through it." Gathering himself together, he leaped straight toward the window, out of which Dorothy and Ozma and the others were looking. With a soft thud, he struck the emerald setting just above the window, and down tumbled his sack, opening as it fell and filling the air with clouds of silver sand. Down tumbled the little old gentleman, turning over and over and finally landing on a blankety white cloud far below. All of this Dorothy saw, and was about to ask Ozma what it could mean when an overpowering drowsiness stole over her. Before she could speak, her eyes closed, and she sank backward into a big armchair. Trot and Betsy Bobbin, with two little sighs, crumpled down to the floor. The head of Sir Hokus dropped heavily on the sill, and not even in Pokes had he snored so lustily. Ozma slipped gently down beside Betsy and Trot, and in a moment there was not a person awake in that whole big palace. Even the little mice in the kitchen were fast asleep, with heads on their paws. Did I say everyone? Well, not quite everyone had fallen under the strange spell. Tik-Tok, Scraps, and the Scarecrow, who had never slept in their lives, were still wide awake and regarding their companions with astonishment and alarm. The Tin Woodman was taking things calmly, oiling up his joints and polishing his tin jacket with silver polish. "This is no time to sleep!" cried the Scarecrow, shaking Sir Hokus. "I say, wake up!" But all their efforts to arouse their companions were in vain. "Enchantment," said the Copper Man. "Some—" With a click and a whir, Tik-Tok's machinery ran down, and as Scraps and the Scarecrow were too upset to think of winding him, he stood as silent and dumb as the rest. "What shall we do?" cried the Scarecrow, seizing Scraps' arm. "Jump out of the window and go for help, or stay here and guard the palace?" Scraps looked out the window. "Stay here," shuddered the Patchwork Girl, drawing in her head quickly. "Then," said the Scarecrow, "let us arm ourselves and prepare to withstand any attack." He snatched up a pair of fire tongs and Scraps grasped the poker. Falling into step, the two marched from the top to the bottom of the palace. Everywhere the same sight met their gaze. Rooms turned topsy-turvy and spread over floors and sofas and chairs the sleeping figures of Ozma's once lively courtiers and servants. The effect was so distressing that Scraps and the Scarecrow found themselves whispering and treading about on tiptoe. After inspecting the whole palace, they returned to Dorothy's room and placed themselves disconsolately in the doorway. "Anyway, Ruggedo is quiet," sighed the Scarecrow, "and that is something." Scraps started to make a verse, but the silence and the ghost-like atmosphere of the sleeping palace had dashed even the spirits of the Patchwork Girl, and she subsided with an indistinct mumble. Ruggedo was silent for a very good reason. Ruggedo was asleep, too. Asleep, sitting up as stiff as a stone image, for even in his sleep he dreamed of the dreaded bombardment of eggs. All this had happened because the little man in gray had taken Ozma's palace for an air castle, and who could blame him for that? Even the Sandman would not expect to find a regular palace set among the clouds. There are plenty of dream castles, to be sure, and one of the Sandman's chief delights is to jump through them and admire their lovely furniture. But sure enough castles, the little fellow could not get over it. Sitting cross-legged on the white cloud, which floated close to Ruggedo's head, he stared and stared. "Well, I never!" chuckled the Sandman, and turned a somersault for very amazement. Then, not knowing what else to do or think, he sensibly decided to hurry home and tell the whole affair to his wife. His empty bag he found on a tall tree top, and without one backward glance he bounded into the air and disappeared. Really, it was quite lucky the little old gentleman spilled his bag of sand where he did, for the only safe giant is a sleeping giant, and while Ozma and her friends lay dreaming, they could not worry. "Will they sleep forever?" sighed Scraps, after she and the Scarecrow had sat silently for an hour. "Seems likely," said the Scarecrow gloomily. "But even if they do," he plucked 3 straws from his chest, "we shall stick to our post to the very end." The Scarecrow regarded the sleeping figures of the little girls affectionately. "To the end of forever?" gulped Scraps, putting her cotton finger in her mouth. "How long is that?" "That," said the Scarecrow resignedly and settling himself comfortably, "is what we shall soon see." End of chapter 15.